So what is happening with migration at the U.S. Mexico border? I mean, over the last, 10, 15 years, we've seen migration at the border increase to levels that make a lot of the conversation here in Washington turn into a giant freakout. And then there's a crackdown. The numbers go down at the border. But ultimately, migrants, smugglers, people who are desperate to flee the places they're leaving and arrive in the United States, those numbers increase. We've often talked about U.S. officials carrying out crackdowns and getting a few months of what looks like success, if you define success as fewer migrants, only to see migrants and smugglers going into wait and see periods and then the numbers going up again. I don't think we're going to see another rise right now, at least for a year. We are in a historic crackdown more than 9 months into the Trump administration. This crackdown, which built on the Biden crackdowns that already were happening in 2024, it's different. It's layered, and it has an incredible amount of money behind it. Hi, I'm Adam Isaacson. I've worked on U.S. foreign policy toward Latin America from a security and human rights perspective for 30 years, always in non-governmental organizations. I've done a lot of work on U.S. military assistance and activity in the region. I've done a lot of work on how governments can help keep their people safe without violating democracy and human rights. And I've done a lot of work on migration and borders and how they can be managed a lot better. So I work at the Washington Office on Latin America, WOLA. It's a terrific NGO that's been fighting this fight for 50 plus years. But this video and audio are not WOLA products, though, for two reasons. First, it has not been reviewed by my colleagues or management at WOLA. That's not because they disagree with what I'm about to say, although who knows, right? It's more because I think they would provide very helpful edits and suggestions. They'll say, say it this way, don't say it that way, or don't present it in this order. And those would be super helpful bits of advice and suggestions. But we are just a few people at WOLA. Our policy and communications teams are already pretty maxed out. I can't suddenly start dumping these rambling videos on them, expecting them to review them. That's all to say, WOLA needs resources. If you like anything I'm doing here on my website, in these videos, any of this content, and you want me to produce more of it and maybe put more of it under the WOLA brand, spread the word about helping boost the capacities of the Washington office on Latin America. Go to WOLA.org and click donate. That's the best way to support what I'm doing, even if it's not exactly under the WOLA logo. The second reason this additional content isn't WOLA branded is that I'm trying something new. I give a lot of lectures and talks. I have a lot of notes and concepts in my archives just bouncing around that maybe aren't ready to be like full-fledged publications. This is me getting my thoughts together. I want to see what's involved with putting them out in this video and accompanying audio format, like as a podcast. Will it stick? Will I keep doing this into 2026, or will I just abandon this idea and we'll never speak of it again? I don't know. I think the end of 2025 is a good time to sort of soft launch this, and that's what I'm trying to do here. It really depends on whether I'm finding it useful for my own work and how heavy the workflow turns out to be. In the meantime, though, I hope that you find this useful. So that was a long introduction, and these will be rambling. But let's talk about where the U.S. Mexico border is at right now. The number of people migrating is still near 60-year lows. This chart shows what an average month looked like for the Border Patrol's apprehensions of migrants in an average month every year since 1925. And you can see here that in October, Border Patrol apprehended 7,989 people, October of 2025, which is one of the lowest monthly figures that you will see since the mid-1960s, since the Johnson administration. People are really not coming to the border right now, and there's been just a steep slide since the end of the Biden administration. If you can zoom in a little here and see that there was a heavy increase after the pandemic. The pandemic hit right here at this low point in March of 2020, increased quite a bit while Donald Trump was still president. And then when the Biden administration came in, around the time that the world's borders were opening up after the pandemic, there was a big increase and also a huge diversification in countries coming. Mexico is blue, Guatemala is the darker shade of green, Honduras is brown, El Salvador is purple. And you can see they were the majority of who was coming during the latter part of the Trump administration. And going into the 2020s, we saw a lot more countries, a lot more nationalities of people coming, a lot of people coming from South America, often going through the Darien Gap. By 2024, about 1 in 10 who were actually from outside of the Americas completely, coming from Asia, Europe, or Africa. You see a couple of big decreases here. In the beginning of 2024, the number of apprehensions went down by about half. That's because the Biden administration leaned very hard on the Mexican government to get them to do more to block people from coming. And that is indeed what happened. There's another decrease by half around June, July of 2024. That's when the Biden administration put through a rule stating that they were not going to offer asylum to anybody who crossed the border improperly by crossing between ports of entry, basically out in the desert or crossing the Rio Grande. Those people would no longer be able to access the asylum system as long as the border remained busy. But then you see this big cliff dropping off in January, February of 2025 with Donald Trump's inauguration. This very steep decrease is also seen at the ports of entry themselves. The Biden administration had a program called CBP-1 where there was an app that people inside Mexico could use to apply to make an appointment at the port of entry as an official border crossing, usually months in advance, and then show up at the port and register their asylum claim. The CBP, Customs and Border Protection, was allowing about 1,450 people a day to sign up for those appointments using the app. And that's why you see this very steady, roughly 50,000 people a month being allowed in. The Trump administration on day one, January 20th of 2025, cancels this program. And it is no longer possible to go to a port of entry the right way, according to the law, and ask for asylum. Asylum is shut off. And that is a big reason why we've seen this big drop off in migration. There's really, I would say, I guess four very overlapping reasons why you have this super sharp drop in the number of people coming. First, again, on January 20th, the White House put out a proclamation suspending the right to seek asylum. If you manage to get to U.S. soil and turn yourself into a U.S. official and tell that official, I fear for my life or my freedom, if sent back to my country, and I would look to apply for asylum in the United States, in the past, you could be processed. You would get due process, and there would be an application process, often quite a backlogged one that would take a while. The Trump administration suspended that. The legality of taking a right that exists in U.S. law and suspending it is very much up for debate. And then there is a case called Raíces versus Noam, which is continuing to go through the courts. Lower courts so far have determined that actually, no, you can't just simply suspend this right, but that remains under litigation. And while it is going forward, largely, not completely, there's still convention against torture and things like that, but the right to asylum is largely suspended at the moment. There's also another reason is there's a lot of detention capacity. The Border Patrol and CBP and ICE now have the ability that if anybody, for instance, under convention against torture does show up and say, I fear for my life and I want to have a hearing, they'll say, fine, but you're going to have that hearing while you wait in ICE detention. In July, the Congress, at the White House's request, passed, well, what was just an enormous, more than $170 billion in new spending for border security and migration spending. But part of that was $45 billion just for detention capacity. Basically, you could take every one of the 30 Major League Baseball teams and buy them a new stadium for $1.5 billion. And that's how much they just gave ICE for detention capacity just for really the next 4 years. So if somebody comes across the border now claiming fear, they're not going to be released into the U.S. interior as happened before. And what this chart shows is everybody apprehended by Border Patrol with the green and the blue showing two forms of release into the U.S. interior. And you can see that really under Trump, almost nobody has been able to be released to await their hearings, as many, many asylum sisters were able to do in the past. So with all that capacity, no releases, people know that there's just no such thing as asylum in the United States. Even if you do need to come, you will be detained. That has dissuaded what had been the majority of people coming to the border in the last several years, were people trying to use our asylum system. Now they cannot, and that's a big reason for the reduction. Another big reason for the reduction that you see here is the climate of fear in the United States. Everybody is seeing these videos of violent tactics being used by Border Patrol and ICE inside U.S. cities. Everybody's reading about what's happening with the detention conditions inside the United States. People are hearing from relatives and friends in the United States saying, no, it's really bad right now. Don't come. I mean, by terrorizing people, yeah, they put them very much in wait and see mode for a long time. Anybody who is thinking of coming here knows about this stuff because everybody has smartphones and everybody's on social media now to an extent far greater than even 10 years ago. And meanwhile, this is more speculative, but the unemployment rate is creeping up here in the United States, even as perhaps 1 million or more people have already been deported or self-deported. from the United States since January. So many people have left the workforce, but the unemployment rate is still inching up. It's in the mid fours. It was under 4% several months ago, and now it's in the mid fours. But that's even with all these people, the overall workforce shrinking because of all the people being deported, which tells you that probably the job market is softer than we think it is. And people are no longer hearing in the region from somebody they know in the United States, come, you'll easily get a job in construction, you'll easily get a job in a restaurant, whatever. They're probably not hearing that right now because the U.S. economy is simply softer than it was. So let's just zooming in on the first 9 full months of the Trump administration. We have the data and it looks like this. The population is no longer multinational. Only about 20 or 30 people a month are coming through the Darien Gap through Panama, which had been the highest I think it reached was about 60,000 in a month. So that has stopped. People are just not bothering to come now because they know about what awaits them if they try to come to the United States and ask for asylum. So the population you have, the blue is Mexico. It's a very heavily Mexican and Central American population, which sort of is the way the situation at the border looked until the pandemic, really. We also have a population that is much more single adults than it has been in the recent past. Obviously, a lot of single adults do ask for asylum, but much of the asylum-seeking population are parents who come with children or children unaccompanied coming by themselves. But right now, in October, for instance, 83% were not. They were just single adults. That is a far more adult population, far fewer kids and families coming now. You can see that at 43% were kids and families during the last full year of the Biden administration here. The population is also coming. Well, it's shifted somewhat geographically in the last several months. At first, the El Paso sector, Border Patrol divides the border into 9 geographic sectors. The El Paso sector, which includes far west Texas and all of New Mexico, had been number 1 for a while, but it's been shrinking. San Diego, the westernmost part of the border, has also been shrinking. And a lot of the growth lately has been in Arizona and South Texas, with the Tucson sector in Arizona now being the number 1 sector at the moment, which is an interesting development that it's moving to South Texas and Arizona. What does this mean? What's going to happen in the next couple of years? You can see here, this is every month's Border Patrol apprehensions this century so far, starting in October of 1999. And you can see we are at a century low for the number of migrants coming every month. Is it going to stay this incredibly low? I would say probably not. If we want to look at the last time that people really didn't think of asylum yet as an option. It was an option, but it hadn't really been tried much at the border. It was a time that was after a financial crisis and after the September 11th year's buildup and crackdown at the border. You can look at Barack Obama's second term when the population of people coming was the lowest it had been since the early 1970s during Obama's second term. You had maybe 25, 30,000 people coming a month, which is more than the 8,000 or 9,000 people being apprehended right now. It is entirely possible that the numbers could creep back up to that level at some point, which still is historically very low. I don't expect it to go higher as long as there is no such thing as asylum at the U.S. Mexico border. One thing you see here too is all these peaks. Those peaks are spring, and often there's a boomlet in the fall. Migration flows, when there are not a lot of asylum seekers mixed in, tend to be pretty seasonal. People come when the weather is not too hot and not too cool. If your plan is to evade Border Patrol and not be caught, that plan would involve being outdoors a lot. Whereas if you're trying to turn yourself in to Border Patrol as soon as you see them, you might only be outside for a day or two at the most, unless they're really backed up. When you have an apprehension evading population, people tend to avoid the hottest and coldest months because it involves being outside a lot. The apprehensions follow more of a seasonal pattern. If I can go back to the last 9 months, you can see an increase from July to September as the weather got cooler, and then it leveled off in October, which means it's not an upward trend yet. And we may see the numbers go down as the weather gets colder in December and January, although all this is at the level of hypothesis because we are in a new world. In terms of the climate here in the United States, in the U.S. interior, arresting a lot more people than they were during the Biden administration, although it's not wildly more yet. It will be. But it's been widely reported that back at the end of May, Stephen Miller, the very, very, very hardline Deputy Chief of Staff of the White House, gave marching orders to ICE and DHS to meet a quota of 3,000 arrests of migrants per day in the U.S. interior. Of course, when you give a quota that high, that means you're not just targeting criminals, You're not even doing a lot of targeting. You are going for quantity over quality, and they're under pressure to arrest as many people as possible. They have not reached that level yet. The main reason is simply they just got the massive resources from Congress in July. There's a lot of hiring that would have to happen. There's a lot of infrastructure that has to be put together. They're filling gaps to get even to this level by redirecting a lot of people who had other missions in the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, DEA, ATF, FBI, Homeland Security investigations, people who had been working on things like stopping child trafficking, gun smuggling, counterfeiting, or drug trafficking are now being reassigned to the immigration control mission, which is how they've managed. And of course, they're deputizing a lot of local law enforcement in the states where, usually red states, where governors have wanted to help carry out immigration crackdowns with their own state forces. That's why they managed to get as high as they are, to close to 1,300 arrests per day. I would expect 2026 to be a year when this goes up significantly. I don't know if they'll actually reach 3,000 a day. That's 1 million people a year arrested and deported. They have the resources to do it, but ultimately, you still need countries that are often the countries that you're deporting to have terrible relations with the United States. You need countries that would be able to take those people, and you need a lot of other adjudication capacity. People still do get a day in court. So we'll see if they actually get that high, but this is going to increase, and you're going to really see it in people's lives and daily realities in a lot of U.S. cities in 2026. What we've seen in Los Angeles, Chicago, Charlotte, and Washington, D.C. is going to keep increasing as more goes online and as there's more cultural change at ICE and CBP, which I'll talk about in a minute. ICE's detention capacity has also gone up to what is now a record, but is still perhaps half of what they expect it to be once all the detention capacity goes online. 65,000 people are right now, as of mid-November, were in the ICE detention system, mostly in privately run facilities around the country. The goal is to roughly double this. They're still putting things online. I think the plan is to involve a lot more sort of Fort Blisses. Fort Bliss is an Army base near El Paso, where DHS, through contractors, has set up a tent encampment, the largest facility in the ICE system, with about 3,000 or 4,000. I'd have to verify that. But the goal is to get up to 5,000 people living in tents on Fort Bliss as they get processed for deportation. And there may be more of that on other military bases and installations around the country. There are reports unhappy people at DHS have been saying that DHS Secretary Kristi Noem and her informal advisor Corey Lewandowski have been sitting on a lot of contracts. They have to sign off personally on every contract over $100,000, and that is causing some delays in getting that to increase. But we can expect that to increase quite a bit in 2026. And then there's deportation flights. The folks at the ICE Flight Monitor, Tom Cartwright's old project, now run by Human Rights First, have shown they have detected a significant jump in the number of flights during the first 10 months of 2025, 1,701 during those first 10 months, which is much bigger than previous years. We can expect that to grow too as more flight capacity, more planes and contractors come online to move people out. The main barrier to really increasing that even further will be countries' ability to take more planes than they have been, or their diplomatic relationship with Cuba, Nicaragua, and other countries that put a limit on the number of flights that can come. But we can expect a big increase in deportation flights and more people being moved out. We have not seen a giant increase in people being moved out yet because there are so many fewer people being arrested at the border to begin with. But the population that is being moved out is clearly made up of people who have spent a lot of their lives, years or more, inside the United States. One clue about that is the government of Guatemala reports on the age of everybody who's deported to their country from the United States. The average age has just jumped in the past couple of years, especially this year, which tells me if they're deporting older people, that almost certainly means they're deporting people who have spent more time in the United States, had grown roots, and are in for much more of a shock when they are sent back to Guatemala to restart their lives, as opposed to somebody who just left a month or two ago, made the journey to the border, and then got arrested and turned back. These are people who actually had roots and ties and loved ones in the United States. Another thing that's going on right now is people in the U.S. interior are really learning the difference between ICE and Border Patrol. The left is a quote from The Atlantic, and the right is a recent Wall Street Journal article. We're learning that for all of the alarming videos about ICE agents breaking windows of cars, pointing weapons at people, shoving that Ecuadorian woman to the ground in the New York courthouse, and doing all of these really traumatic courthouse arrests. ICE, in comparison to Border Patrol, are the careful cops. They're the ones who are doing investigations and trying to target people and know who they're going out to look for when they start the day. Less and less as they're under pressure to meet quotas, but that is their preferred way of operating. And even the border czar, Tom Homan, who a lot of his career was spent at ICE, a super hardline pro-Trump guy, but one who seems to prefer targeting criminals and doing more detective work rather than just random confrontational sweeps, which of course is the modus operandi of the Border Patrol contingent that has been going from city to city, Chicago, Charlotte, soon New Orleans, with Greg Bovino, who until January was the chief of one of the quieter Border Patrol sectors in El Centro, Southeast California. Greg Bovino now sort of the swaggering, social media friendly, camera ready face of this operation, and apparently not even in the regular DHS chain of command, reporting directly to Secretary Noam with his 200 to 250 agents who are using extraordinarily aggressive tactics, both with migrants, U.S. citizens who they believe might be migrants, and with protesters. Bobino has already been scolded or limited by federal judges in Kern County, California, in Los Angeles, and now in Chicago, where a judge accused him of lying to the court and lying in depositions many times during some hearings over their use of force. So there's a real cultural clash and the rest of the interior of the country is learning what a lot of border communities have known. Border Patrol is not trained to be discriminate. They are trained to be out there in the countryside where nobody is looking and to look for anybody suspicious and grab them without any prior intelligence, and quite often to be quite aggressive with the people that they do encounter. If you're doing that in the deserts of Arizona in the middle of the night and nobody's watching and nobody has a cell phone camera, that's one thing. But when you're doing it in a densely populated neighborhood in Chicago and people are out there with their cell phone cameras and they're seeing what you're doing, the video evidence has been overwhelmingly showing what those tactics really look like. Bovino has a lot of say in an ongoing wave of replacements of ICE field office directors and new promotions inside Border Patrol as well. The culture cheered on by top levels at DHS and the White House is very much headed away from that policing model that ICE follows and more in this cowboy aggressive model that Bovino and his contingent represents. And we may see a lot more of that model proliferating in more U.S. cities simultaneously rather than just going from one city at a time. This may be a nationwide issue in what is going to just be an incredibly tumultuous year, 2026. Speaking of tumultuous things going on, I mean, we can't not talk about how this ties in with, the boat strikes going on in the Caribbean. You've got 21 U.S. strikes with drones killing 83 people who were apparently suspected of carrying drugs, may have been in some cases. We don't know about all the cases, in clear violation of use of force standards, human rights law, international humanitarian law, law of the sea, just simple common sense. Those are continuing, as is this very steady encroachment and gradual escalation with threats to use military force inside Venezuela. There's just a few characteristics of these operations we should talk about. First, there is the theme of the president declaring a group to be an enemy, usually a terrorist or an invader. Migrants are invaders, right? Those carrying out a predatory incursion, if they want to invoke the Alien Enemies Act to do it. But there's this presidential power to say, you're on the list. You're on the enemies list as a narco-terrorist, and that means that we can treat you as a terrorist. It doesn't mean you can invade your country. This is sort of building a legal pretext for this. And it's the power the president has really without any serious congressional review unless they pass a law overturning one of his designations. And that's not going to happen in this Congress. The president then goes from there to claim the power to use the military to kill civilians without a declaration of war or an authorization of the use of force, claiming that there's a non-international armed conflict happening with the people aboard the boats, basically giving the military a new role to use force, including against civilians. It's not a self-defense justification for using lethal force, nor did the person in question commit a capital crime, but they still claim to use that power. These seem to be illegal orders to the military. The Department of Justice in the U.S. government is no longer independent. I mean, it was always part of the executive branch, but we have years and decades, generations of norms saying that, prosecutors from the attorney general on down and the Justice Department are independent of the president, and it's improper for the president to fire them and replace them with yes men and to have them just follow his dictates, because then he can obviously decide to prosecute all of his political enemies, or the president could use it to cash in with a lot of settlements. Any of his friends could sue the U.S. government and the DOJ would just settle for them and write them a check. There's all kinds of reasons why you need the Justice Department to be separate, which in Latin America, usually the Fiscalia, the Department of Justice, the prosecutors are a separate branch of government. The Department of Justice is putting out Office of Legal Counsel opinions saying that the illegal orders to the military to kill civilians are in fact legal. And here's the really convoluted justification that they're coming up with, which are mostly in secret. A military officer that disobeys those orders because they are plainly illegal could be court-martialed because the Justice Department has come up with an independent legal opinion. You add those three things together. This is a terrorist. The military has the power to kill civilians, and there's legal opinions to justify it. That's happening in the Caribbean, could happen in Venezuela. Why couldn't it happen at the border, where much of the border is now considered a national defense area, basically in an extension of a military installation, where the military now has a role in apprehending people? Why can't it happen with the military confronting people in places like Chicago, which is what the president has wanted them to do, although he's been stopped by judges so far? This is really scary. This could be the beginning of something we could see used against migrants at the border, but also in the U.S. interior to make this mass deportation with the very aggressive tactics the Border Patrol has represented happen more widely and ultimately happen with the military, which has been quietly no enthusiasm for doing what Hegseth is telling them to do. But military leaderships do change over the course of a 4-year administration. So keep an eye on those phenomena. You can see where it is tied together. Just end with one final note. There's this drop in migration. And of course, this is the one thing that President Trump still has a positive approval rating on. Not his management of immigration, but his management of the border. People see this and say, oh, success. Few people are coming. Is a rise in migration a bad thing? It is if it's disorderly and nobody has put in the infrastructure to process it correctly. You've got B-roll images of massive numbers of people walking across the river and overwhelmed Border Patrol agents. But is more migration at the border a bad thing? You could say yes, because people having to come to the border to migrate shows how broken our immigration system is. It shows how antiquated our laws are. People who want to come here should have more access in their home countries to refugee resettlement, temporary work permits, a residency process. They simply don't. Our laws are old, and our Congress is so divided and polarized that they're not going to change anytime soon. More migration isn't necessarily good, because immigration judges do find that in a significant proportion of asylum cases, they find that these are people who would die if they didn't have access to asylum in the United States. They are granted asylum, which means that they actually were facing very real danger in the place they were fleeing. Our asylum program, as flawed and overwhelmed as it is, has been saving thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of lives every year. If more asylum seekers who qualify are coming, that's good. We want our country to be a place of refuge for people who face very real threats to their lives and freedom because of their race, nationality, religion, political beliefs, or membership in a particular social group. More migration isn't necessarily bad either, because the United States economy has needed the labor. Our birth rates are just not enough to feed our economy. During the Biden administration, those high numbers of people arriving included an increase in the immigrant population, including the undocumented population, but the unemployment rate didn't go up. It went down quite a bit, even in the last year of the Biden administration. This tells me that our economy was taking every warm body that it could, and it really needed the warm bodies. I don't know what it's going to do without those bodies now. It's going to be recessionary not having them. So, where does that leave us? With this Congress and current polarization in the United States, we're not probably going to see a fundamental change to our basic immigration laws, at least not until 2026, and probably not while Donald Trump is the person who would be signing that into law, unless he has a very big change of attitude. You can at least make the asylum system work. You can do something about these backlogs and years-long waits that don't work for anyone, not for the U.S. system and not for the asylum seekers themselves. Facing real threats to their lives and freedom should be able to come to ports of entry. That CBP-1 program was far from perfect, but it was actually recognizing that that was the way to do this right. They should be able to see judges and asylum officers as fast as real due process requires, not just biding their time for years while they wait for the court to have capacity to get around to them. They should have that capacity to get around to their case much more quickly, not so quickly that they can't prepare their case, get the evidence together and talk to an attorney, but quickly enough that they're not just sitting around for 2 years waiting for their eventual court date to happen. They should get decisions ideally within months in most cases without being in limbo for such a long time. If they don't qualify for this or any other protection and our laws don't offer anything else, then they must be taken back home in an orderly, respectful, and professional manner. Not this brutality, not this overt cruelty, not these miserable detention conditions. Treat them like people, but treat them like people who unfortunately don't have status in the United States. When they return, they will say to everybody they talk to, I did get treated fairly, but I didn't qualify and I was only there for a few months. Word will spread. And that kind of outcome should be satisfying enough for most of U.S. public opinion, except the most fire-breathing hardliners. You've kept protection-seeking migration orderly, but you haven't actually taken away the right to asylum. You've just made it finally work in a way that we never bothered to do after we added asylum to the law books in 1980. We're not taking rights away if we do it this way. Neither party should be in the business of taking away rights. But we're far away from that right now. In 2025, going into 2026, 2026, it's going to be worse. It's going to be more brutal. We're going to be seeing a lot more alarming videos and heartbreaking stories all around the country, even as the situation at the border remains calm with so few people coming. We're all going to have a lot of work to do. With the federal government here in Washington in the shape that it's in, much of the work is going to be happening in communities and between communities. We've seen that in a lot of the response to the roving band that Greg Bovino and his Border Patrol contingent have been doing. The popular response to that has often been quite disciplined and quite effective. Let's leave it there. That's a lot to talk about. It's a lot to chew on, but there's a lot going on. I look forward to talking about other topics in future videos as I figure out how to do these. But thank you for watching and listening.